In the opening days of what analysts are already calling one of the most dramatic chapters in modern Latin American history, Venezuela awoke to chaos, confusion, and shock. Reports spread rapidly across international media that President Nicolas Maduro had been caught completely off guard by a sudden and overwhelming turn of events that unfolded within hours. Explosions echoed near key strategic sites, airspace was abruptly restricted, and communications across Caracas became unstable, fueling panic among citizens and officials alike. Social media flooded with unverified videos showing military convoys, helicopters circling government buildings, and crowds gathering in disbelief, trying to understand what was happening to the country they woke up in just a few hours earlier. According to early statements from Washington, the operation was described as a decisive move after years of escalating tensions, sanctions, and failed diplomatic efforts. U.S. officials claimed the action was aimed at restoring stability and ending a prolonged crisis, while supporters of Maduro immediately rejected this narrative, calling it an outright act of aggression and humiliation. Inside Venezuela, state television went silent for several hours, a move that only deepened speculation that the leadership had been stunned and unprepared for the scale and speed of the operation. For Maduro's supporters, the moment felt like a betrayal of sovereignty. For his opponents, it felt like the collapse of an era that had defined Venezuelan politics for more than a decade. Rumors spread that senior officials were scrambling to regroup, emergency meetings were held behind closed doors, and regional governors waited anxiously for instructions that never seemed to come. International markets reacted instantly, with oil prices fluctuating as traders tried to assess what this shock would mean for one of the world's largest proven reserves. By the end of the day, one thing was clear: Venezuela had crossed a point of no return. Whether seen as liberation or invasion, the sudden shock to Maduro's rule sent tremors far beyond Caracas, setting the stage for global reactions and a rapidly unfolding international crisis. As news of the dramatic upheaval in Venezuela spread, reactions from across the Americas and the wider world came fast and fierce. Governments, international organizations, and political leaders were forced to respond almost immediately, aware that what had just happened could reshape global norms overnight. In Washington, officials defended the move as a necessary step after years of stalled negotiations and worsening humanitarian conditions, insisting that the action was not aimed at the Venezuelan people but at the leadership they accused of driving the country into collapse. Across Latin America, the mood was far from unified. Some governments expressed deep alarm, warning that the use of force against a sitting president set a dangerous precedent for the region. Others, especially those long critical of Caracas, cautiously welcomed the change, arguing that Venezuela's crisis had destabilized neighboring countries through mass migration, economic disruption, and security concerns. Emergency meetings were called by regional blocs as diplomats worked urgently to prevent the situation from spiraling into wider conflict. In Europe, leaders reacted with visible unease. Statements emphasized respect for international law, sovereignty, and due process, while calling for restraint and dialogue. Behind closed doors, however, policymakers debated whether this moment marked the return of a more aggressive global order, where power outweighed diplomacy. Russia and China issued sharp condemnations, framing the events as a clear violation of international norms and warning that such actions could have consequences far beyond Latin America. On the streets and online, public opinion was deeply divided. Venezuelan communities abroad erupted into protests and celebrations at the same time, reflecting years of polarization. Analysts noted that the shock was not only political but psychological, a signal that long-standing assumptions about immunity, power, and global rules were being challenged. As night fell across world capitals, one question dominated discussions everywhere: if this could happen in Venezuela, where might it happen next? As the political shockwaves continued to ripple outward, a new layer of discussion began to surface in media debates and online commentary: the role of religious and cultural communities inside Venezuela, particularly the country's Muslim minority. Social platforms buzzed with claims, counterclaims, and dramatic narratives suggesting hidden movements and sudden shifts in influence. For many observers outside the region, Venezuela was being rediscovered not just as a geopolitical battleground, but as a complex, multicultural society often misunderstood from afar. In reality, Venezuela's Muslim community has long existed quietly alongside other religious groups, woven into the fabric of everyday life rather than positioned at the center of power politics. Concentrated mainly in urban areas such as Caracas and Maracaibo, these communities are largely made up of families with Middle Eastern roots who arrived generations ago, building businesses, mosques, and cultural centers. As the crisis unfolded, community leaders called for calm, urging followers to stay out of political violence and focus on humanitarian support, dialogue, and coexistence. Still, the chaos created space for speculation. Commentators hostile to the Maduro government attempted to link foreign alliances and religious identities into a single narrative, while others pushed back strongly, warning against turning a political crisis into a religious storyline. Scholars and analysts emphasized that Venezuela's turmoil was driven by economics, governance, sanctions, and power struggles, not by faith-based mobilization. Inflaming religious angles, they argued, risked deepening divisions and spreading misinformation at a moment when clarity was desperately needed. Within Venezuela itself, ordinary citizens were far less concerned with ideology and far more focused on survival. Food access, electricity, safety, and uncertainty about the future dominated conversations across all communities, regardless of belief. As Season 3 of this unfolding crisis revealed, the danger was not a hidden movement, but how quickly fear and rumors could distort reality in times of extreme political shock. As the immediate shock began to settle, attention shifted toward the future and the long shadow this crisis would cast over Venezuela, the Americas, and the global order. Inside the country, uncertainty ruled every level of society. Government institutions appeared fragile, rival political forces maneuvered for control, and ordinary citizens waited anxiously to see whether daily life would stabilize or slide into deeper chaos. The question was no longer just what had happened, but what kind of Venezuela would emerge from the aftermath. Internationally, the events triggered intense debate about sovereignty, intervention, and power. Diplomats warned that the precedent set here could reshape how strong nations deal with governments they view as hostile or illegitimate. Allies and rivals alike recalculated their strategies, aware that the rules of engagement seemed to be shifting. Some feared a return to an era where force spoke louder than diplomacy, while others argued that this moment marked the beginning of a new global realignment. Economically, the stakes were enormous. Venezuela's vast energy resources suddenly became central to discussions about reconstruction, sanctions, and global oil markets. Investors watched closely, humanitarian organizations prepared for potential waves of displacement, and neighboring countries braced for instability spilling across borders. Every decision taken in the weeks ahead carried the risk of either easing tensions or igniting new ones. By the end of this chapter, one truth stood out clearly: the story was far from over. What began as a sudden shock had evolved into a turning point with consequences that could last for decades. The world watched Venezuela not just as a nation in crisis, but as a symbol of how fragile order can become when politics, power, and perception collide.